Provincetown, July 1974. A hiker follows a dog's bark into the dunes and finds a woman on a beach blanket. There is no ID, no hands, and almost no trace of how she came to be here. For decades, she is known only as the Lady of the Dunes, the coldest cold case on Cape Cod. Almost 50 years later, a DNA profile gives her name back, Ruth Marie Terry. 1 year after that, investigators point to her husband, long deceased, as the likely killer. Today, we rebuild the timeline, the science, and the choices that turned an anonymous homicide into a solved case without a trial.
Welcome to Crime Bite.
In this channel, we peel back the layers of those hidden realities, raw evidence, conflicting testimonies, and emotional pleas for help that too often come too late. By looking into these crime bites, you'll see firsthand how broken trust, systemic oversights, and chilling motives can converge into stories that rattle us to the core. If you find this exploration as vital as we do, be sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notifications button. Together, we can shine a light on the cases that demand attention, ensuring every voice, especially the silenced, finds the audience it deserves. On a hot afternoon in late July 1974, a girl walking in the dunes outside Provincetown followed a dog's barking to a scene that would anchor one of New England's most enduring mysteries. A woman lay on a blanket in a depression in the sand near a sandy access road. She had been killed with brutal force to the head, nearly decapitated, and her hands were missing, likely removed to block identification. Investigators estimated she had been dead for days, perhaps weeks. There were no signs of a struggle at the scene, which suggested she either knew her killer or had been asleep when the attack came. The press and police would soon call her the Lady of the Dunes. What did they have to start with? A body on a blanket and a few small clues. There were tire impressions some distance away and two sets of footprints in the sand that appeared to lead toward the location. But the Cape's summer winds erased patterns fast, and any trail to a vehicle or an accomplice faded with the evening tide. Early forensic work documented striking details. The victim had distinctive, expensive dental work, the kind that could have connected her to a particular dentist or region. There were belongings beneath her head, including a blue bandana and jeans. Her toenails were painted pink. The investigators hoped the dental work would unlock a name across state lines. It did not. When a crime scene is as sparse as sand and sky, what clue do you trust first? The footprints, the tire tracks, or the story the body itself can tell? Provincetown Police and the Massachusetts State Police processed the site with the tools of the mid-1970s. No DNA, no national fingerprint or dental databases with the breadth of today. The victim's hands were gone, so the classic fingerprint path was closed. Investigators took dental x-rays and circulated them widely. They combed missing person bulletins from New England to the West Coast. Nothing matched. The body was buried that fall, marked not with a name, but a date and a place. The working theory was blunt force trauma as the cause of death, with the crushing injury to one side of the head possibly inflicted by a military-style entrenching tool or similar heavy object. That conclusion would hold across the decades. But the who and why were stubbornly blank, and the case went cold. Time did not end the effort. The Lady of the Dunes was exhumed more than once as technology improved. Each time, investigators hoped a new facial reconstruction, a new isotope test, or a better DNA extraction might connect her to a family. The case became the state's longest-running unidentified homicide. If you had one piece of evidence to carry forward from 1974, would you choose the dental films, the head wound analysis, or the exhumed samples that might someday yield DNA? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click on the notification bell for more. In the absence of a name, the Lady of the Dunes became a magnet for theories. Some were small and local. Others were colorful and national, from a pop culture rumor that she appeared as an extra in a beach crowd shot, to whispers that notorious criminals traveling through New England might have been involved. None of it led to a family who could say, "She is ours." The forensic anchor remained the same. A woman between roughly 20 and 40, athletic build, with notable dental work and a violent death by head trauma in the dunes near Race Point. The case file grew thick with interviews and road trips that went nowhere. What kept it alive were Provincetown's memory, the state police cold case unit, and the idea that a future test might do what a 1970s bulletin could not. That hope would prove justified, but it would take nearly 50 years to cash in. When a case gathers more legend than leads, how do you tell the difference between a helpful story and a detour that drains time and trust? On October 31st, 2022, the FBI's Boston division made the announcement that rewrote the opening line of every article about the case. The Lady of the Dunes had a name, Ruth Marie Terry, born in Tennessee in 1936. Investigative genetic genealogy, which combines DNA sequencing with traditional family tree research and record matching, linked degraded DNA from the remains to living relatives. Agents corroborated those relationships with direct family testing and background records. Massachusetts officials briefed the family before the public heard the news. The technical step that changed everything was the ability to generate a usable DNA profile from decades-old bones, then compare that profile to relatives who had been tested or whose lines could be inferred from public records. It is not instant magic. It requires careful lab work, genealogical spadework, and then traditional policing to confirm the candidate. Here, that chain produced a firm identification and a starting point for a renewed homicide investigation. When a science that did not exist at the time of a murder supplies the victim's name, does it also reset what is possible for finding the killer? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click on the notification bell for more. Once the Dunes yielded a name, the case stopped orbiting a silence and began tracing a life. Ruth Marie Terry wasn't a sketch on a flyer. She was a 37-year-old woman who loved, traveled, made plans, and left impressions in more places than the Cape. Identifying her rethreaded the narrative from who is she to who walked beside her and what path brought her to Provincetown in the summer of 1974. Investigators rebuilt her world the way genealogists always do, from the outside in. They started with kinship matches and spiraled out through courthouse ledgers, yearbooks, city directories, and DMV rolls. Any record that tied a date to a place to a person, and that person to Ruth. The picture that emerged was of a woman with ties to Tennessee, Michigan, and California, moving as people did before smartphones left breadcrumbs, using variations of her name common to the era. Sometimes a middle name emphasized, sometimes a married surname, sometimes a slight spelling shift that made her hard to pin to a single file card. Those variations weren't a grand disguise. They were the practical fingerprints of mid-century paperwork, marriages and divorces, and life on the move. Friends and relatives, newly contacted, filled in human details official records never keep. The forensic sketch that had lived under the words Lady of the Dunes finally had a proper caption. Ruth, with stories that belonged to people who missed her, not just to detectives. She liked the ocean air, someone remembered. She could be impulsive, another added, willing to pull up stakes for a fresh start. She had reasons to be in New England that summer, including a relationship that had taken a formal turn not long before she died. Once a name lands, investigative questions harden. Who purchased tickets? Who shared addresses? Which car was driven by whom and when? Investigators plotted an itinerary across that pivotal year. A marriage, a trip through parts of the country that matched earlier family recollections, and a return by one party without the other. Gas station receipts, motel registers, bank activity. These aren't cinematic clues, but they're the rails on which a homicide reconstruction runs. The case file began to accumulate travel markers. A room checked out in July, a car observed by acquaintances, a comment to a confidant that she died, all details that meant little in 1974 when the victim had no name, and meant everything in 2022 once she did. Ruth's identification also reframed her dental work, once a technical clue cast into a national void. With a name and family context, those films weren't just distinctive. They were a match to living relatives' memories of dental history, and a corroborating detail that aligned across science and story. Even the small things, favorite polish on her toenails, a way of pinning hair, returned from the domain of anonymous evidence to the texture of a person. Above all, the name turned the investigation toward intimacy. Statistically, lethal violence often grows from proximity. Partners, spouses, companions on the last day. Now the question wasn't abstract, it was chronological and relational. In the summer of 1974, Who was in Ruth's daily orbit? Who left with her? Who came back without her? And what did they say when asked where she'd gone? The answers pointed to the same figure. They also exposed a troubling story from that same summer. A story that had traveled only by word of mouth until a cold case finally found its voice. Once you finally have a name, do you widen the lens to every city that touched her life? Or narrow it to the last 2 weeks that decided it? The post-identification trail led to the person most investigators would examine first in any homicide: the spouse. Records showed that Ruth had recently married Guy Rockwell Muldavin, also known in some circles as Raoul Guy Rockwell, a man whose resume blended charm with reinvention. He moved in the antiques trade, a line of work that rewards a certain performance, appraising value, telling stories about origins, selling the romance of provenance. He knew how to inhabit a room, to set a tone. He also knew how to move on. After genealogical work put Ruth's name on the case file, detectives retraced the summer of 1974 with Muldavin as a fixed point. Witnesses recalled travel, miles covered, states crossed, the kind of itinerary that blurs when receipts fade and memories fold into new lives. What stood out wasn't just where the couple went, it was who returned. When Muldavin came back from that trip, he was reportedly driving a vehicle believed to be Ruth's, and he told people a story. Ruth had died. How exactly was not presented with the precision investigators later demanded. What is precise is what followed. Her family never saw her again. Decades earlier, and a continent away, Muldavin's name had surfaced in a Seattle area investigation, a grim case involving the deaths of his then-wife and stepdaughter. That history didn't culminate in a murder conviction. By the time Massachusetts authorities assembled their conclusions in The Lady of the Dunes, Muldavin had died in 2002. But cold case work is pattern recognition as much as it is lab work. You don't infer guilt from the past, you contextualize the present. Here, context mattered. A man with a documented proximity to violent tragedy in one chapter of his life, now tied by marriage, travel, and last seen proximity to another. Investigators didn't lean solely on pattern. They built a post-ID evidence spine: marriage paperwork, acquaintances' statements about that summer, vehicle and travel indicators, and the absence of any credible trace of Ruth after the window in which they believe she was killed. In homicide investigations, absence can be circumstantial. Combined with a spouse's uncorroborated tale, it becomes probative. Multiply that by a prior suspect history. Again, not a conviction, but an alarm bell, and a picture sharpens even when no courtroom will ever convene. It is vital to be clear about what the case wasn't. There was no late-breaking fingerprint, no hidden confession letter discovered in an attic trunk. This closure relied on modern identification to unlock old human testimony and to reevaluate a cluster of facts that in 1974 had nowhere to land. You cannot assess the credibility of "she died" without first knowing who she is. Once you do, you can ask, where is the death certificate? Where is the hospital? Who saw her last, and how do their accounts mesh or fracture? Those are the questions that at last had a target. By the time Massachusetts authorities addressed the public, they were careful, even in certainty. They named Ruth Marie Terry, and they named Guy Rockwell Muldavin as responsible. They also acknowledged that death ends the road for prosecution. But the line they drew was based on converging lanes. The marriage, the trip, the return without Ruth, the vehicle, the stories told in 1974, the lack of any trace of her life afterward, and Muldavin's prior shadow over another family's catastrophe. For those who loved Ruth, that answer is both gift and ache. It affirms what happened. It denies the chance to see the person responsible, reckon with it in court. Cold cases often end that way, not with a gavel, but with a statement and a photo on an easel, and a request that we remember two names together, so the victim is not defined by the killer, and the killer is not left out of the story that explains the victim's fate. How much weight should a suspect's past, documented suspicion without conviction, carry when present-day evidence points the same way, and the only courtroom left is the court of public record? On August 28, 2023, the Cape and Islands District Attorney announced that the Lady of the Dunes case was closed. Investigators concluded that Guy Rockwell Muldavin, Ruth Terry's husband, was responsible for her murder in 1974. Because he had died years earlier, there would be no prosecution. For a file that once read unknown female, that statement delivered a different kind of resolution. It named the victim and it named the killer. It returned a person to a family and identified the person who took her life. Authorities summarized the post-identification work that supported their conclusion, including travel history, witness statements about the summer of 1974, and the context of Muldavin's background. It was as close to a courtroom as the case would ever come. When a cold case ends with a deceased suspect, is the right word closure, or is it simply an answer with no chance for a trial? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click on the notification bell for more. The long road from 1974 to 2022 was paved with persistence. The victim's dental records were preserved. Her remains were exhumed more than once so that new techniques could be applied and reconstructions updated. Regional police agencies kept the case active in the public eye, and Provincetown marked the mystery as part of its civic memory rather than a forgotten file. In the end, the material that mattered most was genetic. Bone and tooth samples that had defeated older methods yielded enough DNA to build a genealogical profile when newer sequencing pipelines and databases came online. That profile connected to relatives, which pointed to records and photos that finally put a name to a face. It is a reminder to every cold case unit that good evidence storage and careful chain of custody work can carry a case to the era that can solve it. If you could save only one category of evidence for the next 50 years, would you choose DNA, dental films, or the original scene notes in a detective's hand? The identification of Ruth Marie Terry is one of the clearest demonstrations that investigative genetic genealogy can finish what older forensics started. It did not identify a killer by itself. It did something equally important. It told investigators where to look, whose door to knock on, which papers to pull from courthouse basements. That process turned a faceless case into a homicide with a victim and a suspect who had a relationship, a timeline, and a known trip that summer. That matters for policy. It argues for funding evidence preservation and genealogical outreach in cold cases, and for robust public communication when a case makes a leap after decades. It also invites hard conversations about privacy and consent in the genealogical space. Those debates will continue. What is not in debate is the relief in families when a number from a lab becomes a name in a phone call that starts with, "We think we found her." Should every long unsolved homicide with viable remains be queued for genealogical work? Or should resources focus on cases with specific leads that DNA can already aim at? Walk the same dunes today and you feel both the weight and the release. For years, the story began with a nameless woman on a blanket. Now it begins with Ruth Marie Terry, a person with family in Tennessee and history in other states, a traveler who came to the Cape in a summer that should have ended differently. The case will not go to trial, but the record now has two names where there once were none. That is not everything. It is something. It is what persistence, careful evidence work, and new science can do when time seems to have had the last word. As you leave the beach and the wind starts to wipe your footprints away, remember the lesson investigators here carried for nearly 50 years. Names matter. Careful work matters. Keeping faith with cases that seem impossible matters. Somewhere in another box, there is a case waiting for the same tools and the same patience. If this is what it took to return a name to Ruth and identify the person who killed her, which unsolved case would you put next in the line for the same tools and the same care? And why? Ruth Marie Terry is no longer a mystery woman on a police flyer. She is a person with a history, a family, and a final walk into the dunes that someone else decided for her. Do you think investigative genetic genealogy should be used on every long cold case, or only when there are strong leads to confirm? Tell us in the comments. If this breakdown helped you see the case more clearly, hit like so it reaches others who care about the truth. Subscribe and ring the bell for next week's episode, where we map every known sighting and travel record from Ruth's last summer and show how those pieces led to a single name. Stay curious, stay kind, and keep asking the questions that bring names home.